Well, hello there. This is Outside the Bubble, episode 24. I'm your host, Joanna Bull, and my guest today is Stephanie Kelmar. Stephanie is the founder and editor of KidNuz, the first ever daily news podcast for kids. Stephanie is a two-time Emmy Award-winning news producer with over 2 decades of journalism experience. She has written and produced content for multiple broadcast and online platforms. She earned her honors degree in Rhetoric at UC Berkeley. Stephanie lives in Palo Alto with her husband and 2 children. Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Great to be with you.
So tell me, what is KidNuz?
KidNuz is a 5-minute daily news podcast targeted toward kids. Basically, we want kids to get a flavor of news without exposing them to stories or any images. It's a podcast, so there are no images that are scary or inappropriate. We want to give them a taste of the real world that's out there. So we have news of politics, current events, entertainment, sports, real life heroes, and other things that would appeal to kids, mostly between the ages of 6 to 13.
Why is it important that kids have a newscast that is specifically targeted to them?
Well, kids are curious and they want to know things, but most of today's news is geared toward adults, and it's mostly negative news about the world, and we don't feel that kids need to be exposed to all of those negative stories to become engaged citizens of the world and have information that makes them feel smarter, helps them figure out what's going on in the world around them, and have information that they can share with their peers and get conversations going with their parents or their peers or their teachers about real life events.
So when I was having a look at some of the episodes, what I really appreciated about them is that they are very obviously for kids, but I got a ton out of them. And I've been reading about how with the rise of anxiety in society, one thing that sort of keeps people anxious is how much negativity they're exposed to every day. And one of those aspects of negativity is news. When you turn it on, there's never positive news stories. It's always tragic and negative, and that keeps us heightened in a sense of stress and anxiety.
It's true. And apparently there's a poll that said 63% of kids admit that the news makes them feel scared or anxious. And having worked in local news, as I did for about 15 years, that's what you present on the local newscast, as anyone knows who watches it. It's the tragedies, it's the disasters, and that's a lot what happens in the news. And the good stories, if there are any, usually are at the tail end of the broadcast. But it makes people feel like that's all that's out there. And kids don't need that kind of anxiety in their life. That's not the entire world. There's a lot of great things happening. And we find plenty of stories to highlight not only actual current events, but positive things that people are doing in the community or in the world that can inspire kids.
That's so great. How was the idea for KidNuz developed?
So I have 2 children who are now 9 and 11, and my son, who is the older one, when he was about 8, he started getting interested in the news and asking questions. And we get a newspaper delivered to our house every morning, and we bring it in, and he would look at it, and often on the front page, images of dead bodies or headlines about disasters. And every day it's like, turn the paper over. And, I looked for things in the newspaper that I could give to him or talk to him about. And there was really nothing that was geared toward kids, sadly. And so I have another good friend who's, you'd like to listen to NPR in the car all the time. And, always like scrambling to change the channel when negative stuff comes on, which it often does. And we were just talking, and it's like, wouldn't it be great if there was news geared just toward kids? And that's how the idea of KidNuz was born.
That's so fantastic that you saw this need and were like, let's just do it.
Yeah, it's been very exciting.
So your audience is kids, but is there a specific age group that it's targeted at?
So we feel that we have a range of maybe about, I would say, 6 to 13 it's a big range to cover, admittedly, for news geared toward kids, but we have fans as young as 5 and 6 and as old as 13. And frankly, a lot of their parents are fans of our newscast too, because they get something out of it. They hear about things they wouldn't hear about otherwise. And they also, adults don't want to be bombarded with the bad news all the time. So, I would say the sweet spot for our newscast as it currently is around the 8 to 11-year-old age. But like I said, we have fans that span the range, and we try to include stories every day that would appeal to everyone. Some of them we have about 5 or 6 stories each day. And some might appeal to one age, some might appeal to another age, but everyone's going to get something out of it. And even if they don't understand the concept, or they might not be familiar with someone we talk about in popular culture or sports, it's nothing that they shouldn't hear or can't hear. And the idea is for the newscast to spark conversations with parents who are hopefully listening to it with their kids. So then the parents can talk about and elaborate on topics that were discussed.
Yeah, a really great starting point for curiosity and inquiry and family discussion.
Yeah, that was our hope.
And you said that you are producing 6 stories a day?
It's we include about 5 to 6 or 5 to 7 stories a day, about 30 seconds each. The entire podcast is around 5 minutes, and it includes a daily quiz, which we find is a favorite part for most kids, where we ask questions about the stories they've heard, and then they can compete with their siblings or their friends or whoever they're listening to it with, and shout out the answers.
A nice aspect of gamification. You've gamified the podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. And they like to test their own knowledge and,
I've listened to a couple of your episodes. I noticed that there's a wide variety of topics, and you spoke about that a little bit. What sort of topics do you cover on your podcast?
we cover stories that we think will appeal to kids. I think about things in the news that I'd want to speak to my own kids about. So we'll talk about politics, but we are always nonpartisan. And we talk about, if there's a big sporting event, whether it's the Final Four or the World Series, we make sure to have the latest scores or events about that. Oftentimes we'll talk about popular culture, but always with a twist on something that would appeal to kids, whether it's a story about, recently we talked about Miley Cyrus, who was up in a Joshua tree and getting some blowback from her social media fans and the National Park Service. Well, kids appreciate nature, and it's a good chance to give them a message about being respectful to nature, and also including it with a pop culture twist on it. But we're giving them a positive message about why this is wrong, what she did according to the Park Service, and they can kind of relate to that even if they don't know who Miley Cyrus is. Or we'll talk about the TSA is putting in new 3D scanning machines, and we talk about how that might make your summer vacation go a little smoother, your trip through the airport. So it's always something that they can relate to, even if it's a concept we're talking to them about that they may not be familiar with. Oh, that's what the TSA is, and that's what they do. So we try to make it like a big picture somehow, but also something that they can grab onto.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about relating to kids, I find that the older I get, the less I know what kids are interested in. How do you stay relevant for the audience, or how do you decide what topics they would be interested in?
It's a really interesting question. And I think it goes back to some of our journalism background. In a job that I had for a long time, producing a local morning news show, it was my job to pick the guest segments or the interview segments for each broadcast. And people always asked me, it's well, you get hundreds of pitches a day from people who want to be on the show. How do you choose? And honestly, it's just a lot of gut feeling about what would be compelling, what would be interesting. But I think for me, that my kids are in the target age range. I'm around them a lot, and I'm around a lot of their friends and then their friends at school. And I sort of, I'm with my kids a lot and their friends. So I listen to what they're talking about and what they're interested in. So I think that's helpful. But my partners, my co-founders also have children, although they're older. So sometimes it differs a little bit, but we all seem to just have a really good grip on when we look at the stories from the news of the day, we look at hundreds of stories before we pick the 5 to 7 that we're going to talk about. And I mean, first of all, they have to be topical, they have to be newsworthy. And then we just, I don't know, we just pick the ones that we think would be of interest.
So what I heard from that is part of it is knowing something about your audience. So the fact that you have children that are around that age, but also your experience as a journalist gives you some really good insight and gut feeling as to what is worthy of the newscast.
Well, yeah, I hope so. And we try to present it in a way that will catch their interest. For instance, a story we just did recently, Burger King is trying out the Impossible Burger in their Whoppers, the Impossible patties. And the Impossible Burger is an all vegetarian patty that they basically are putting in their Whoppers or trying it out in a couple of their stores. But the way they presented it was through an April Fool's prank with some of their customers, where they substituted the meat patty and they put the Impossible Burger in instead. So, we start off the story talking about Burger King pulled a prank on their customers, April Fool's prank, and that automatically catches the children's interest. And then we talk about what they did, and then we could talk a little bit about what the Impossible Burger is and how it's vegetarian and plant-based and how it's better for your health and it's better for the environment, a lot of people would say. But we just present that information, and so they learn a lot within the span of 30 seconds, even though it's something that they may never have or would never have heard of before, but now they know. So just a little bit of insight into what's going on in the world.
I love the idea. And so many times when I was in the classroom, especially teaching English, I would listen to the news in the morning. And then when I arrived at school, the first thing that I would do was talk about some aspect of the news with my students. So even just presenting something that I had heard about, and it wasn't like I was spending a lot of time researching, but I would just say, this is what I heard in the morning. Like, what do we think about this? And have conversations in order to ground what we were doing and what's happening in the world, because it's important to be a citizen of the world.
That's right. That's great.
Is there anything around the timing is there a purpose for the 30 seconds? Is there a reason that the stories are that long or that short?
Well, when we decided on about we thought a 5-minute podcast would be good, but we wanted to have the ability to present a variety of stories. So that's just kind of what we landed on.
Okay. I was wondering if it had anything to do with the fact that kids can't pay attention for as long as they used to be able to, although I'm not 100% sure that's true, or the society that we live in where everything is rapid. I was just wondering if there was a reason for the 30 seconds.
I think being a news podcast, I know there are a lot of kids podcasts out there that may run about 20 minutes long, but for us, we felt like this would be a good starting point. And you can give a lot of information in 30 seconds. I mean, I obviously am aware that attention spans may be getting shorter due to all the time spent online, which is unfortunate. But one of the reasons we wanted to use the podcasting format is so kids would listen without distraction, whether it's at the breakfast table or in the car or when they're brushing their teeth. And it really improves one of the educators that is supporting our broadcast talked about the importance of listening and how this kind of format really improves kids' ability to do that. So that's something that we're pretty proud of.
And is the podcast meant to be like for kids to listen to on their own, or is it meant to be listened to with parents or teachers or in a moderated situation?
Ideally, we would love for parents to listen to it with their kids or teachers to play it for their classroom, because the whole idea of doing this was to spark conversations where this would be a jumping off point and kids could learn even more and kids could ask questions to their parents. And if their parents have information about a story or have a political bias that they want to present to their kids, it's their opportunity to do that. And this is more of a jumping off point. But we designed it so kids could listen to it independently. And we want parents to know and teachers to know that there is nothing in the podcast that is going to scare or alarm a child.
And before I hit record, we had a brief conversation around the fact that you are aware of some teachers using it in the classroom. How are they using it, or how do you see it being used in the classroom?
Well, we've heard just randomly, because we really just organically We haven't done a lot of marketing yet with our podcast. We wanted to make sure it was a product we are very proud of, which we are. But I've heard from teachers from Pleasant Hill, Iowa, from Rochester, Minnesota, who've organically heard about the podcast and are incorporating it into their classroom. So they're play it after the school-wide announcements, and the kids raise their hand or they shout out answers to the quiz, and it's just gratifying to hear that teachers on their own are doing this.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I'm a big advocate for student directed inquiry and student voice in the classroom. And also, I work with a lot of teachers and I speak with a lot of teachers, and teachers are always feeling, I shouldn't say always, but often are feeling quite stressed and quite overworked, even though we love our jobs. So for me, introducing something like this into the classroom environment allows for dialogue and conversation around topics that have been selected and curated, but have a jumping off point. So if we're going to listen to, 5 to 6 stories in the morning, then we have some direction for inquiry. What do we want to learn more about? And if you have a class of 30 students and they're listening to 6 different stories, then they have some choice in what they want to explore further. And then you can bring in your literacy connections and your social science connections and everything else. So for me, it's a fantastic tool to, dare I say, eliminate some of the lesson planning that teachers get really stuck in.
Well, we hope to be a helping hand to teachers because we know how overtaxed a lot of them are. And sometimes it's difficult. Everybody is so busy these days, and it's hard to know what stories to talk about with your students or with your kids. It's not that everyone has time to go ahead and curate them, like you said. So we are doing that as a service for them. And we think that there's, some of our stories are about kids doing heroic things around the country, whether it's one girl was coming to a nursing home, and she noticed that a lot of the patients were maybe a little bit depressed or a little bit sad. And this one woman, I guess, was very sad because she could no longer get visits from her dog. She couldn't afford to have someone bring her dog to her anymore. So this girl on her own started a fund and basically went around and asked every patient like what they would want, and raised a bunch of money to grant these people their wishes. And it's something that she wants to expand in other cities and other states. And we love to present stories like that to inspire kids that they can actually do things in the world that make a difference.
Part of the work that I do is running what's called design thinking challenges for teachers and for schools. And I recently did one with some coworkers, and we were working with 60 grade sevens. And design thinking is all about empathy building and finding a problem and coming up with a solution to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to see that there are kids in the world that are doing this because of needs that they see allows students to understand the purpose of some of these activities that we do in school, and that it's a process for designing and building relationships with people and solving problems in the world. I'm just making some of my own connections here.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
So you have a background in journalism.
Yes.
How did you end up teaming up with your partners in order to create this?
Well, we all work together at the local Fox morning show, Fox affiliate morning show here at KTV in the Bay Area. And I know these are dedicated broadcasters, dedicated journalists. We are all Emmy-winning journalists and all moms. We're very proud of both of those things. And we work together in the trenches producing live television for decades. And I knew that these are people I could count on and people I trust. And we've all been working together on this goal. So it's just been a great experience.
So right now, is this a bit of a passion project for everybody, or are you all still working as journalists?
Oh, we are doing this. We've been working on this, mostly full time. And I guess you can call it a passion project. We've been using a lot of sweat equity and putting in our time just to build it. and make it something that we're proud of, and the positive responses we're getting from educators and parents. And like I said, my children are in elementary school. And just yesterday, a woman who has 4 boys walked up to me, and she had heard about the podcast recently at a school meeting. And she told me that she just started listening and she loves it, and her kids love it, and they love the quiz. And she thanked me, and it's just really gratifying. I was a little bit a little bit surprised that she hadn't heard of it before, because I feel like I'm talking about it a lot around school. But I was happy to hear that she did hear about it and that she's liking it. And so it makes all of us feel really good.
How many collaborators or partners do you have?
There are 4 of us. There's myself, and I have 2 co-founders, Rosemary, who does a lot of the bulk of the writing and most of the editing, and then Tori, who does the most of the anchoring, and then we have Kim, who also does some of the anchoring. And so the 4 of us every day put it together, and we all have a say in the stories that we choose and how they're presented. And if anybody has an issue with something, then we talk it through before it ever makes air.
I think it's important for people in general to talk about how it really does take collaborative partners and teams to make something happen. Because I feel like in school, we ask students to do so much work in isolation, or when they're working with a group, that everyone has an equal role in what it is that they're doing. But to hear you talk about how there's 4 partners and everyone plays a role and has very specific skills that they bring to the table in order to make this happen is really important. I don't feel like we talk about that enough with our students.
Well, I think it's very important. Like I said, I fully admit that this idea had been brewing for years in my head, and it wasn't until I enlisted Rosemary truly that I told her about it, and she just immediately said yes. And that's when it happened, because you have accountability to other people. I mean, obviously, life gets in the way. I have, like I said, 2 children. I have 2 older stepdaughters, and a very busy life raising them, and enjoyable. But once you get other people involved and excited about something, it really puts it more of a priority, and your accountability to them, and an investment in the time and everything. But that's what really made it happen. So I think it's very important to respect everybody's roles and opinions and the hard work that we're all putting into it.
So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions just about your journalism background.
So I went to UC Berkeley, and I was a rhetoric major. And when I was still in school, I got my first job as a radio producer in San Francisco. And I started working while I was still in school full time. So I worked at some news radio stations, and then I produced some talk shows. And so I've always been around newsrooms and been around entertainment and guests. And then I went on to my first full-time job when I was about 21, and I was in radio for about 4 or 5 years. And then I segued into the local Fox morning show, where working in a newsroom was just very exciting, working closely with reporters and editors and assignment editors, deciding which stories to go after and seeing how things are reported and making sure that everything is reported fairly was obviously the number one priority. So when I booked some guests for the morning show there, oftentimes we'd book politicians and newsmakers, and sometimes there would be 2 or 3 guests in a segment where everybody's view was represented. And other times we would have one guest, let's say on one side of an issue, but we would make sure that the host, and he was just a fantastic journalist, he always represented the other side, because as a news person or journalist, it's just very important to be fair.
So I don't think I actually know any journalists in my life. And our perception of journalists is probably mainly formed from what we see on TV, which I'm thinking of, every sort of TV show that has to do with the White House and all the journalists that are sitting in the room. And I think journalists have a bit of at least in my perspective from what TV shows us, a bit of a reputation of being aggressive and maybe not playing by the rules. So I know that's not true, but that's what TV sort of portrays.
Well, you need the drama for good television, don't you? You need conflict and drama and all of that.
But I think unfortunately, many of our realities are sort of accidentally shaped by what TV portrays.
Mm.
So what is journalism in your perspective?
Getting information out there and presented in a fair way. Just getting the facts first of all and getting them right, and just that would be the number one thing. Just bringing information to the public in a fair and responsible way, and that certainly had been my experience.
And is that done through interviewing or research or a combination of skills?
All of it. You first you have to find the story, and then you have to some oftentimes track down the people who you want to interview, and then you talk to them, and if you feel like they're not being honest, you need to challenge them, but you need to have your facts before you go in and do that. And obviously in television it involves gathering video, gathering pictures, and presenting it in a way that is clear to the audience so they understand the issues and they understand circumstances about what's happening in their community or in the country or in the larger world, and hopefully engaging people to get involved, make a difference, or just be knowledgeable about issues that matter to them or should matter to them.
And has journalism changed with the internet and social media?
I think it has, only because, back a long time ago, there were fewer institutions, fewer companies or broadcasters who were presenting information, for good or for bad. But one of the things I think maybe they were more trusted, more vetted, more experienced journalists out there. And today's world, anybody can be a writer, anyone can be a broadcaster, anyone can be a journalist. And while that's on the one hand fantastic because you have a mix of voices and representation that you didn't have in the past, you also have less vetting about who is this person who's giving you this information. Is it real? Is it fake? It's harder to ferret out unless you know enough about journalism to know that these people can be trusted. So I think it's a little bit more challenging for an audience, and I think it's more important to keep an eye on who's giving you information.
That's definitely super important. So I know that there's so much work being done around like what is a digital citizen and how do we evaluate what we see online in order to decide what is factual or truth. And that can be very challenging for teachers and for kids because it's so easy to just look up something on Google and read it, and if it's written well, to believe it.
It's true. It's true. And another thing that, everything obviously seems a lot more partisan these days, and it may well be. But for oftentimes, I'll be, if we have the television on and there's a newscast on, my son will ask me, well, is that person a Republican or a Democrat? And I keep saying, they're journalists. They're journalists, and it's hard to just get that point across that, until a very short time ago, people didn't reveal their partisan biases on television, for instance, and now it's a different world.
So I'm just sort of thinking about writing and how we teach writing in school. Are there any tips that you can share with teachers regarding writing strategies, specifically around journalism or investigation or question developing?
Well, that's not exactly my background, but I could definitely offer that it's important to engage people. Whenever you're writing, you need something that grabs their attention. And I also say that editing is the most important tool a writer can have. Less is more. Make your point, don't belabor your point, and use as few words as you possibly can to get your point across to keep your audience engaged. I think as a journalist, that's important. And in terms of writing questions, I think it's all about curiosity. You're writing a question to get an answer. You want to get information. So think about whatever it is you're writing about, questioning, and think about what you would like to know, and think about things that you don't know, and ask your questions, form your questions, do try and elicit those answers.
Thanks for that. Now, as a secondary teacher, so high school, and speaking with students around career pathways and choices, when would an individual decide that they should go to school for journalism?
Some people get the journalism bug early. Other people, it might come to them while they're taking classes in college. So I think it's definitely an individual choice. For me, I was always interested in politics and I was always interested in broadcasting. And those things came together for me. I majored in a subject called rhetoric, which is it's a rare, but it's all about basically talking to an audience and maybe convincing them of something that you want them to think about. It's all about finding common ground with your audience and then slowly with different tactics moving them over to your beliefs. So I thought that was
Ooh.
really interesting. I
Oh.
thought it was a very, very interesting, and that you can use that tool in any kind of argument or discussion, or whether it's with your parents or with your boss or with your friends, talking them into something that you believe or you want to do. And it all starts with finding common ground and getting them to agree slowly, walking them over to maybe a different position than they started in. So I think in today's world, it's a very important tool.
Oh, definitely. That's fascinating.
Mhm.
Is there any sort of quick example that you could give?
Well, basically, basically, when you use a rhetoric, you either approach them with a logical argument, an emotional argument, or an argument based on something called ethos, which is sort of your standing in the world. So you can, let's say that you're going to see a movie with a friend and you each want to see different movies. And so you might say, well, this movie basically got a great review on Rotten Tomatoes and the New York Times says it's blah, 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 blah. And so they're like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that before. And then you could say, I really wanted to see this movie and this is the only time I'm going to get out this week and I'd love to see it with you. And then you're sort of appealing to them in an emotional way. And or you could say something like, you picked it last time, this is my turn. And so you could just sort of get them like that. But, just sort of, just an easy example of how you can bring someone along to your thinking.
Yeah, definitely. I love it. I feel like a lot of people would say, isn't that just a form of manipulation? Like playing with emotions in order to manipulate somebody.
Possibly.
Okay.
Possibly, yes.
There's a lot of different language for strategies, I find.
That's pathos, which has been used for a very long time. And I think if you listen to people in the political arena, they definitely use those three different skills to convince people of their way of thinking.
Right, and it's definitely a skill. And I find I find it fascinating when I like reading Facebook comments. I don't and I think the reason that I like it is I'm always fascinated by the way that some people attempt to develop arguments online. But these like arguments that I see in Facebook comments, I'm like, what, this is so unproductive. It's like everyone needs some of these skills in order to be able to formulate their argument and draw people slowly, at least to a place of curiosity instead of a place to immediately getting their back up and want to defend their position.
You definitely never need to threaten anyone or make them feel bad about their choices. It's a very, you can, talk to people and approach them and you can try out your arguments, but I think you need to be respectful always of people's ideas and their feelings and their beliefs. So, you know, I wouldn't use it as a weapon.
I'm just thinking about like the online arguments that people get into and how it becomes really, you can feel the heat through people's words, but it's sort of like two people just yelling at each other back and forth about their belief system. And that I don't think has ever brought someone over to your side. The more I yell at you, the more you're going to want to defend your position. You're not going to believe anything I have to say.
I imagine that's true.
So, going back to your podcast, what you've talked a little bit about some feedback that you've received, but how has your podcast been received so far and where are you hoping for it to go?
Well, we are very excited to get an endorsement from Parents Magazine. They
Mm.
named us one of the top 12 podcasts your children should be listened to. We've also had some great response, as I've said, from some local educators in our area, teachers, parents, and we're just, growing organically right now. People are telling friends, and it's so great to be talking about it with you. And we're just excited. We're excited to expand. We have some ideas on how we can reach even more people, and we're excited to get the word out at this point.
That's so great. And I'm very happy that we connected so I can help you spread the message and the word.
Thank you. It's important.
Is there anything else you would like to share before we wrap up?
I would just love for everyone to give it a listen and listen to it with their kids. And we are always looking for feedback. We have some information on our website. People can get in touch with us. We would love to hear from people. We have a KidNuz Club that we just started where you can sign up your child for a potential shout out, and they can get some cool swag in the mail. And we are just interested in engaging kids with the world, satisfying their curiosity, and having them grow their minds.
And where can people find you online and listen to the podcast?
We are at www.kidnuz.com. That's KIDNUZ.com. And they can find all the information there. In addition to our daily quiz that we have on our podcast, we also recently started a weekly quiz online. So kids can go on and test their knowledge of the week's news every week. And that's been a lot of fun.
Thanks so much for sharing everything about the podcast and about your background in journalism. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it. Thanks so much for spending time with me today and listening to my conversation with Stephanie all about KidNuz. I definitely think you should check it out. They have tons of amazing content. And like we chatted about, definitely great for if you're a parent and you want to engage in conversation with your child around news. But definitely if you are a teacher. And while she did say that the audience was for between sort of 6 and 13 with really like a 9 to 11 audience, I also think that grade 9 teachers out there, even grade 10 teachers, can definitely be using it as a jumping off point for inquiry and conversations. So I'm going to say anywhere from like kindergarten right up to grade 10. Definitely check it out. See how you can integrate it into your classroom in the beginning of the day or as a inquiry or research component. I see all types of different uses. Check it out. Let me know what you think. If you do use it, definitely get in touch with Stephanie. Let her know how much you appreciate what it is that she's doing. And like always, we can have a conversation on Twitter @IdeaSmashing. Love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.